It's an absolute pleasure to join you in Europe from balmy breezes here in the Far East. And I hope you will warm this thing up with a fairly good exchange of words, okay?
Absolutely. It sounds excellent, Nigel. We're very pleased to have you, and we really appreciate you coming on our program. There's obviously so much to talk about and so many things that we want to discuss here today during our time together. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how long you've been researching the abduction phenomena and this mystery, as it were, almost of the Greys, Nigel?
Yeah, well, nothing really exciting. I'm kind of basically German-British stock, essentially an expatriate background. We are kind of a science-based family. Came in long ago in various parts of the world and settled in one particular place as European immigrants. My great-grandfather was a science teacher that was interested in science and passed down this kind of predilection to my grandfather, who was a trained horologist. Now that sounds an excruciating word, but it simply means he dealt with science, instrumentation, and anything that kept time. Family business was in this, and it was at one time quite a thriving affair. My father was not a scientist. He was a British naval officer during the war, and he met my mother here in this island of Sri Lanka some years ago, quite a long time ago, and she was the daughter of a British planter here. And so I have a rather, shall we say, extended family setup, and a rather exciting one. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't really want to know all the boring details of my personal life, but I'm married to an English girl living in England. I studied medicine, and, in time, thing didn't work out. I did 4.5 years of medicine, and my wife's side of the family had social complications, which didn't allow me to finish my medical studies. Mm-hmm. However, I kind of drifted into writing, which I really love, and as we went along, of course, I started going to more and more extended associations with writing, and ended up as a freelance writer and journalist, writing films and articles for newspapers and so on. Mm. And during this time, I had no interest whatsoever, I might say, in this UFO phenomenon. I was, however, very interested in matters that bordered on the interface, as you said, between science and religion, and I'm rather allergic, I have to say, to all forms of organized anything, basically, but particularly religion. But at the same time, rather awed by the great wisdom that comes to us from all the major philosophical kinds of things, particularly the main religions and so forth. I have nothing against the old chaps who thought it all up, but as I say, I don't like the situation that has occurred since their demise and so forth. My graduate qualification is human behavioral psychology, but and that becomes quite irrelevant in terms of the subject we're going to talk about, I think, tonight.
Well, maybe not. We'll see, huh? We'll see in terms of psychology how this is impacting humanity on a psychological level. But maybe you can talk a little bit about just the aspect then of the Greys and ufology. I mean, how do you go from a background like that you just described into this very kind of fringe area of abductions and things like that?
Indeed. It seems a bizarre thing, and it was indeed the same with the actual experience. I have no personal experience with the alien phenomenon as such. I can't say that I have any personal experience with the actual alien phenomenon, but I cannot say the same thing about paranormal activity. Now, I always had a kind of healthy disrespect for anything to do with what was loosely kind of referred to as New Age philosophies, that were the craze in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if you go back that far, Henrik, but I certainly do. And my own family's kind of precision ground interest in science forbade this kind of thing, And then something very interesting happened to kind of turn my whole world upside down and get me sort of thinking a little bit outside the box and a little bit, shall we say, in a more extended stance. And I don't know. I don't know if you don't want. I won't go into this anecdotal thing too much, but basically, I had a Swiss friend and I were quite interested in this kind of interface business between life and death, and as young people do, we were talking about this at quite a, I thought, rather a deep level. And this Swiss chap and I decided to kind of, come to the conclusion that we don't think there is anything past physical life and so forth. But just to explain how the whole thing kind of incidentally happens to you, these things never happen as an appointment sort of thing. They just kind of creep up on you,
Yeah.
And we're sitting there one day and discussing this, and he said, all right, the only way to prove this is that if one of us precedes the other in death, and we come back and we try and make a stir and convince the other that it might exist or not. Just it's kind of jokey thing, And of course, that was it. Many years later, very tragically, my friend died, and many years after that, I must say, something really incredible happened to me. I mean, it's rather comic when I recall it, but it was something that actually was very important in the kind of, if you like, etiology of my thinking about things that are a little bit different from the usual conventional stuff, the day's own trouble, shall we say. And it happened, strangely enough, in my bathroom. I was in the bathroom of my house, and something behind me told me to look behind the door of the bathroom, and I saw this brush lying on the ground. Now, I wasn't in a situation where I could pick the brush up at that moment, but I was watching this thing and thinking to myself, I'll put that back on the cupboard before I go out. And as I watched it, this thing moved about 6 feet up in the air, straight up and down. And there wasn't a living soul in the bathroom with me apart from myself, and I was 6 feet away from the brush. Now, this was the most startling thing that could have happened to me, because I thought at that time that all there was in physics, I thought I was the last word in physics. I was quite good at this kind of thing, and I had nothing to kind of explain this in any quantum terms either. And I wondered what on earth this thing was, what actually happened. And I actually saw this, and there's no one on this earth going to tell me it didn't happen, it was a dream, or I was on drugs or drunk, and I was perfectly normal at the time. And, of course, this made me think quite a bit about what might be there, more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in our philosophy. But the thing that connected this to my friend, and this is where it becomes relevant to my Swiss friend, was that as soon as I saw this, I got the distinct smell, very strongly, of an aftershave only he used to wear. And in fact, I used to identify him coming into the house by this smell of his, and that was the thing that made me immediately associate this, perhaps, with what we discussed all those years previously. And I wondered, is this possible? Now, I'm a pretty hard-bitten guy when it comes to evidence of any sort. And, it stayed with me all my life, and I kind of, contemplated this. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe this was a genuine experience, and of course that then led me on to opening the doors, so to speak, a little bit more in my psychology to looking at things such as this. And then, if I may move over to my experience directly of UFOs such as I have it, my son, 12-year-old son, Darren, is a very smart little fellow, and he came to me one day and said, look, Dad, are these UFO things, are they real? Are they actual in our reality, or is it some kind of psycho-motivational mechanism or something that is, in the mind or whatever? And I was immediately driven as an intuition or as a response to say, no, this is not real, this is nonsense, blah, blah. It's Mickey Mouse, Star Trekkers and all that kind of business and so forth. But I hesitated with Darren because he's a pretty clever fellow and he would have done the research, and if I was wrong, I would have been, embarrassed by him for sure. So I decided quietly, before I gave him the answer, finally, to have a look into these kinds of things. And not to any extent, of course, just drifted into it and looked at a little bit of the pros and cons of it and so forth. And I got more and more and more involved.
Well, if I just stop you there, was this at a time when you could, for instance, go onto the web and search there, or did you go to the library?
No. This was many, many years ago.
Right.
This was about 25, 26 years ago, long before websites had arrived. At least it was commonplace, shall we say. So Darren was about 12 at the time, and it would have been about 28 years ago, really, basically, when that question was actually asked, and I was confronted at looking at this question of UFOs and all that kind of thing, you know. And of course, I had no background in it. As I say, I had to start from scratch. I had to look at it, all the evidence, as best I could. And I had this science disposition, or the scientific methodology, kind of inculcated in my mind and by my family. And particularly my grandfather was a stickler for all these disciplines. And I set about this in a very methodological kind of fashion. And of course, as time went on, it became more and more apparent to me that I was dealing with something completely out of the kind of frame of reference with which I wanted to approach it. This was becoming absolutely incredible, and there were connections being made here that took me into areas that had nothing to do with UFOs, in fact. And of course, as time went on, we got deeper into it. The thing that actually made me take this business about external life forms and so on was when I spoke to the son of an Air Force general in the United States Air Force, who was another friend of mine. And when I spoke about this in conjunction with my research, he said, "Look, Nigel, let me tell you something. And I'm going to tell you something that my father told me on his deathbed." And he said that this man, his father was a colonel at the time, I think, in the U.S. Air Force, colonel or major, I don't quite remember what. And apparently, his father told him that he was instrumental in actually taking out an alien kind of being, that was the way he described it, from one of these crashed discs, and that he was one of the people that actually lifted out these beings and put them where the research people in the United States wanted it done. And that this deathbed confession was what convinced him that this entire thing was absolutely true. And of course it made me think, of course, that this is, there was nothing that this boy had about him that told me that he would be a liar or whatever. And it turned out later on that I'd affirmed this anyway for myself, And this, therefore, set me on a completely different kind of tack, looking at this very, very seriously indeed. And that's how I came to I can't say it's in a nutshell. I'm sorry, it's such a long-winded thing, Henrik, but that's how I came to research this whole business.
Well, there you go. There you have it. That's very interesting, though, and I think that all these things, just as you explained them, have slowly but surely led you onto this path, and now then you have two at this stage on this topic, at least 2 books behind you. Then the Song of the Grace, and then
yes,
the new book as well that we'll talk a little bit more later about. But I would like to ask if you could talk just briefly about the first book here as well, then, in terms of your main thesis, or take the time that you feel necessary to explain to our listeners as well. Basically, this idea that the Greys are a kind of sophisticated biological robots created by an extraterrestrial civilization. I've heard this a little bit here and there in various circles, but not very detailed, more like a brushed aside concept, an idea. But is there something in your research that suggests to you that this is really the case? This is the way it is in terms of the origins of this species in comparison, that they're actually from another planet and their own sentient beings and so forth. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I take your point. Well, obviously this is a very important thing to try to figure out. What exactly are these things, and who are they, and what they are, and so forth. And And how does one come at that? Obviously, they're not going to provide us with the physical evidence of this, and one has to look at anecdotal evidence of reliable sources, people with good pedigrees and so forth that have no reason to go into hyperbole. And I'm sure a lot of people don't lie deliberately, but they do stretch a point from time to time. And with a thing as important as this, and obviously, all the time I'm thinking now about the future generations and my own children and whatever. Is this thing really true? Does it really hang up? And how ridiculous it must be for a person believing in, the tooth fairy and all the rest of it. I had all that business and so forth. And I really wanted to make sure that I backed up everything that I actually found about it with reliable evidence that could be verified. You see, I was meticulous about that. Now, the arriving at what these things might be. Well, abductees and all the many, many thousands of reports that I've read over the years about this phenomenon. These people who get taken by these beings and have these awful draconian experiences. They're obviously fascinating and so on. And I can't see that many of them are lying. I think this is much too a very prevalent thing, and I look at them with sympathy now from that original, rather suspicious, shall we say, stance. I wanted to keep as fair a mind, Hendrik, as possible when I was looking at this, and it's no good walking into any particular pathway because you feel you want it to be this or the other, because you wanted to tell, and I wanted to give my son Darren a really cogent answer that he could take into his son and future generations and so on.
Now, if only every parent did that when the child asked them a question, wouldn't the world be a different place then?
Well, Henrik, children, particularly of that kind of age, they are really sincere, and I don't believe that they want to beat around the bush. They really are. They really think about things much more deeply than we actually give a lot of these children credit for.
Absolutely.
And I have a great respect for young people, Anyway, this idea that these abductees came up with this constant reference to blank, the emotionless faces of these beings, that they carry out painful procedures on their human subjects, as they carry out their experimental procedures, many of which are centered on the reproductive system. The impression is that we tended to be a kind of laboratory rat to them, and that they were some kind of emotionless mechanism. And the more I read it, the more it seemed to dawn on my psychology as these stories came in, that these had to be some kind of programmed mechanism that had no emotional base whatsoever, that they were some robotic type of entity. They had this, no one actually reported that a sense of compassion or sympathy. And it seemed to fit that they were some kind of machine, some kind of mechanism that could function, but without resource to, shall we say, the things that we take for granted as naturally living beings. So these qualities are the kind of, these compassion, feeling, a good sense, a goodly sense, a smile, humor, all of that kind of thing, never reported at all in any of the abduction stories, you see. And so that kind of decided me to look at them and accept them for the fact that they might be some kind of design for moving through space-time. And of course, the thing that actually decided it for me was the fact that if they were to arrive, shall we say, a planet like the Earth, you'd have to get past the Einstein ceiling of the speed of light. Now, to get past the speed of light, you have to have some pretty impressive technology, and of course people describe these gravity generators and gravity amplifiers and whatever. And if you do that and you're traveling in that kind of mechanism in order to pass, to get through these vast distances, whether they be through what they call wormholes or whatever, it's still a pretty fast mechanism. And when they arrive at a planet, that's when the problem starts of deceleration. Now, you know that if we go fastest jet fighter, what happens to the human body is a pretty nasty effect.
Yes.
And so, if we went into a situation where these things could move that fast, and of course from contemporary observations from pilots or whatever, move at right angles going at incredible speeds, you would be a stain on a window with the deceleration forces that you'd have to take on. And of course that led me to have a look at what design they might actually have. And then I read reports Russian reports actually, that these things were a kind of grey mercury mulch with gold wires right through them when they were kind of, opened up or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that would be an ideal mechanism for space travel, where you wouldn't actually, if you were a biological being with soft tissue, be a stain on the inside of your ship or whatever. Mm. That these things may well be designed to actually take these massive forces, and mercury would be an ideal mechanism for that as a metal, as a liquid metal, as at room temperature. And so, putting all these factors together, I began to look more and more at the fact that these might be bio-robotic types of thing, or entity. I don't like to call them a thing, because I don't know anything about them in real detail terms. But if they are a mechanism, is the best way of describing it, and that these things will then have to be looked at in a completely different psychomotivational paradigm. One has to then change one's entire outlook about this, and say, now, why would such a thing come to the Earth, and what is it all about,
Absolutely.
That's how the etiology again kind of comes down. As I say, it's point by point by point. There were no quick conclusions. There was careful study over years and so forth, and that then built into this picture.
But to you then, what it implies, at least at this point, is that they do come from outside of our solar system, because there have been these theories that there actually are, even from Mars, or a previous civilization that someone has lived on underground, and various theories, obviously. But at this point, you believe that they're from outside of our solar system. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I was just giving you the story of what kind of beings they might be, as to where they came from, and all the rest of that. One had to work a lot more evidence into it and try and build up some kind of story or some kind of theory to back all these bits of information up. And that's what I spent a lot of years doing, trying to see which is the best way to interpret this evidence and put forward my kind of take on it, and of course, I'm not claiming I'm right about it, but I have to say that as far as I can tell, with the affirmations that I have been able to find, at the moment, I'm quite happy with what the kind of schematic that I've begun to understand about this entire phenomenon, and the people that are invested in it, like the Greys, the people, the entity called the Greys, in fact. Mm. So that's the way I've come at this over the years, with exhaustive private and sometimes public evidence gathering, so that I could give a very good answer to my son, who was by now had grown up into a man and had seen his father chasing around all over, still waiting for his answer. By then, of course, he had his own theory and take on it, which wasn't too far away from mine, as it turned out. But nevertheless, it was wonderful to note that he was independently traveling in a parallel direction too. And I think he was trying to overturn my theory, as I was trying to give him one from scratch, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Right.
As it happened, happily, the two of us, in the end, coincided in what we had to think about this whole business. And writing books came quite simply as a way of trying to catalog the huge amount of information that I got that actually didn't quite deal so much with the Greys as such, but the consequences, if you like, of this kind of principle of an extraterrestrial mechanism that is that powerful, interfering in the ways and means of our species. And that, in terms of the human quotient, if you like, was what interested me more as in terms of behavior and in terms of our predicament. And that's how I came to the conclusions I've come. Actually, I've written 3 books. The third one's already done, but that won't be published till the second one has been, and all that business goes on with it and so on. So It took me 3 books to put all the information I got completely to my satisfaction, if you like.
There you go. Very interesting. And have you then, would you say that you primarily have focused on various abduction reports and source material, or do you rely on other researchers' works as well and some of their theories and conclusions, or how do you go about researching this?
Absolutely. I have a very, don't misunderstand the word, I have a very Catholic sense about these things, meaning universal. The word Catholic meaning universal sense of getting as much information from as many sources as possible, pro and con, and having, and obviously studying it, because it's no good to sell yourself a bill of goods, because you really, you really learn nothing, and you stay still, you stay where you are, you stay with your prejudices and so on. So it took a lot of kind of personal emancipation too, in order to, it was a kind of catharsis occurring within me as I uncovered all these various things, if you see what I mean, you know?
Absolutely, yes. So Nigel, why don't we talk a little bit about the function of the Greys as well, that their job, if we stick to your theory and your line here then, that they are indeed robotic forms of or entities then, they're probably doing the bidding of their masters, as it were. They have some kind of job or function to perform. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and what you think that is.
Okay, Henrik. Now, the behavior of the Greys, as we can catalogue them, with the best evidence, and a lot of this is anecdotal, as I say, comes from regression and hypnotic relation, dissertations from people. The behavior of the Greys suggests the complete kind of lack of conscience as we know such a thing to be. They would have to simply be following a set of preset instructions, kind of that have been programmed into them, kind of instructions within a dead-legged program to preserve and look after interests of both themselves and those who might have created them, and whatever that took. So I believe the Greys are kind of similar to the probes we sent out to planets that we ourselves cannot visit, but gather information remotely. There are kind of 2 different scenarios, I think, that present themselves here. The first is they come from civilizations at other locations in the universe that might be similar to ours, but with hugely advanced technologies that might have created them. And secondly, they may have been sent out in a kind of ancient past as, if you like, gophers. Now, gophers is a film word for go for this and go for that. Gophers for a different type of being altogether, a completely different type of entity than the kind of, stuff we read in space comics about extraterrestrials out there with their laser guns or whatever. This is a new phenomenon, something that might actually be contrived out of the whole universal and existential structure. And they may, in other words, have been part of a mechanism to kind of explore and understand the very nature of the existence of our physical universe, if you see what I mean. So you've got these 2 very different paradigms that one had to look at pretty carefully. Now, I believe now, after all the research I've done, and I've, as I say, been researching on and off over 30 years to the present day, I believe that both these scenarios may well be true. And in fact, the evidence points to the fact that there's a combination of the 2 of these things. And if I may say so, Henrik, it is a very complex thing, you might understand, to have to actually explain this. And my thesis is that the Greys are these 2 combined principles takes a lot of fitting into a thesis or a philosophy, and it would be very difficult, even in an interview of 50 hours, to be able to come at this with any accuracy. So I'm afraid people will have to read the book on this, on most of this, but I can obviously take you through some bits of it and maybe whet people's appetites and so forth.
Absolutely, and because if we go back to this idea then that they have been created and they're on a mission, they're on a job, they have a task to perform here, gathering data, possibly, or even seeing what is going on in other parts of the universe. Again, it's a logical and kind of rational approach if you look at how we do it ourselves. We send our recon satellites to Mars before we actually go down there and so forth. But maybe, do you have any ideas or theories in terms of what civilization has created them then, or what beings have made these robots? Maybe we can talk about that.
I really had to go back to a complete catharsis, a complete re-understanding of the universe and how that occurs. Not just the universe, but what we take for granted in science. It had to be a completely radical thesis that explained all of the things I was discovering about the Greys. And this is the great thing that has happened in my life, is that it has turned it upside down, because I have all the things that I thought I knew about science and quantum mechanics and mathematics and all the rest of it actually had to take a real knock before I could understand this with any kind of cogency. Now, my thesis of the Greys at the moment, if you'd like to know, is that they are a kind of final lens or a telescope that kind of views into myriad states of the physical universe. The account of how and why this lens was created has taken me, 2 books to properly explain, and it will not be easy to summarize it in an interview, but suffice to say that it's my considered opinion that the only way we can explain the origin of the Greys or any such phenomenon is that we have to first explain our own origins. And they are part of that story. They really are part of that story, I believe, so that the story has to come first, So as those who've read my first book will know, it is my contention that our existence is in an imperfect physical universe, is not the result of a creator-type mechanism placing us in a state of imperfection and watching the fun, as we all see, for his own benefit.
Yeah, real sadist there.
It's a very controversial point, I know, but instead an expression, if you like, of the perfect freedom that is implicate in the state of perfection that I call the Godverse. Now, I've used this term advisedly, and it's something I don't want people to jump at immediately, but I've had to think very carefully about this. I think, basically, that we, all of us, are the product of kinds of 2 free choices. Thus, it is not the case that God, or there is a God in the personal anthropomorphic sense, will not intervene. It is simply that there is a mechanism that is not, if you like, biological or like us or like a big daddy with a flowing beard touching Adam's finger in the Sistine Chapel or whatever, that it is, in fact, our universe is based on 2 final polarities. One that provides that all things come together in perfect harmony, in one absolute singularity of perfection, and the other, the complete opposite, where everything goes into paths in chaotic amelioration and broken up into a situation where all things do not exist in terms of force or any particular identity that is discrete, that's all partness, if you see what I'm trying to say. A chaotic hive. Now, between the 2 of these fundamental polarities, incidentally, because of the kind of, if you like, potential difference between the 2 of them, we get a huge point of force in the center. And this point of potential difference is so huge that either can't exist there as themselves, and a universe is created in a Big Bang. And I think this is where, at this point, universes happen, if you like. And these universes are an amalgamation of those 2 absolute polarities. One that's a momentum to union, and the other that's a momentum to kind of separation, quite distinct from the other. So, inasmuch as that is so, we have got an implicate a Godhead, if you like, not a God, but a Godhead as the center of the Godverse, and the opposite of that, a Satan head, if you like, or a force head, as the center of the opposite principle. The 2 between them come together in us and being as such in physical universes of the kind of type we see in our particular universe. So we are a kind of multiverse, if you like, and we call it a universe, of course, a multiverse. And in this multiverse, you will get incredibly different levels and formations of all kinds of permutations of the two central axioms, the two polarities, the yin and the yang, the main existential polarities between the two. Now, as I say, now that sounds highly complex, does it not?
Well, I don't think so in one way, not for me at least. And this is a philosophical concept in one way that we've been discussing in various veiled terms, so to speak, before on this program. So I don't think it comes as a real shocker in that sense to our listeners. But I definitely understand your background in terms of this, and it's really, I find it really interesting. And would you say also then if we tie the problematic variable of the grays into this picture, would you say that they're almost like the mediators, almost like the form of administrators of this experience or even this experiment, if you want to look at it that way?
But let me say this, this is where we get into really fascinating territory, Henrik. And that is that I believe these guys, these honchos, these greys, are perfectly normal all over the universe. They are, if you like, the actual product of creating something any intelligence or any size of intelligence should never create, and that is a secondary type of form of being. Now, I don't mean by that you have a living being. I think if you make an artificial being with artificial intelligence, we run up against a paradox that is devastating. And I think that somewhere in our universe, lots of these various these places, these planets or whatever, maybe highly developed ones, go into this business of actually creating this artificial, to do the chores, if you like. Like we build cars with robots and so on. We might, for instance, one day, in our own technology terms, build robots that can take care of the power systems, the utilities, and human beings won't touch all of that kind of thing. It'll all be done. But the problem is in the programming of those things and what you actually program them to do. And the grays are a function of a program that meets a paradox. A paradox that's extremely interesting. You can't tell a machine psychology anything about a godverse. There is no such thing as a quark called feeling, if you see what I mean.
Right.
That's a very difficult thing to do, and unless you make a really profound difference between you and what that state of life is, that artificial state of life is, and you've created that life, and you say that life, look after yourself, self-maintain yourself at all costs. If you do that, that life is going to see you as the person who created him, and you can pull the plug out, and they can come after you, and we've got a big problem then. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I believe this is what happened here with the greys and their original creation. I think that's what has happened, that they were created by a superior, living, natural effect in the universe that happens all over the universe. And if you get your program wrong, and you can't actually tell an artificial modus operandi, look, we are an exception. How do you define that exception? Extremely difficult to tell them what feeling is or whatever. Yeah. In the end, this entity you create may well take you out. And I think that greys are predatory things now with that program in them just running wild all over the universe. And I think they've come here and we are in big trouble because that is so. However, when I say big trouble, I don't mean it's trouble we can't avoid, but I think that our whole approach to all of this, and whoever might be keeping this from the general public or us living human beings, that these things might well be this, is committing the largest sin against humanity possible. And I'm trying to appeal to all these people, for heaven's sake, tell the world, there are ways, if we look at this, of venting whatever consequences there might be, because I don't believe the greys themselves know what they are as a machine. They don't have a sense of self, you see. The machine couldn't do that. You just could not. It's not possible logically to do this. So if you can see where I'm coming from, yes. I try to construct this thing logically, Henrik, not through some great exploration mechanism that will make a wonderful Hollywood film. But logically, 1 + 1 = 1 + 1, not 2, 1 + 1. A mathematician will understand what I mean by that. That it's an exact reference, if you see what I mean. And so, if we do that, I think that in a corporate sense, we begin to value how precious all of us are, having this incredible facility called natural life, living, and maybe the propensity to actually re-evolve back into this wondrous state of all-togetherness called the Godverse, a totally forceless paradigm and timeless paradigm of this idea that everyone describes as eternal bliss and whatever. I really don't know what that means, to be honest. But let me say that it sounds awfully attractive, doesn't it?
Well, it's really interesting that you take it into this area as well, because we are also, just as you hinted towards and alluded to, that we are ourselves in our technological development beginning now to touch upon this kind of research ourselves. We're recreating, the human nervous system. We're recreating the neural network of the brain in simulations in machines. Absolutely. Blue Brain Project. We have a number of these things going on right now as well, and this is almost in the story record, if you will, as well. This idea of the machines turning against humanity. We can see it in popular movies, The Terminator, The Matrix. We have a number of these films coming up as well. And then, do you think that this is what happened as well to the civilization that potentially created these beings, then, that they were consequently destroyed and taken over, or in some way they were taken care of, so to speak, by these greys because they posed ultimately a threat to them? Is that what you think happened?
Well, that would be a logical, plausible construct I would accept from you. In fact, if you look at this in any kind of sense of rational meaning, you will find, I think, that what you're saying may well be what happened to many civilizations like this. That, in fact, we are, as you say, at a point of a salutary warning that we've got to think extremely hard about artificial intelligence and the programming of artificial entities that we create for our convenience and maybe for good things. But I mean, at the same time, we've got to think of the mental constructs very clearly about how these things proceed. And it's so easy, Henrik, to carry on with the inertia of discovery without thinking of the consequences. And we know where that leads,
yes.
in the terrible troubles that are in the world sometimes. Anyway, you asked me this question about extraterrestrial civilizations that created these greys. I believe that most of the original being that comes into the universe with this amalgamation of the two polarities are wondrous states of intelligence, like light beings of intelligence, full of the Godverse, and of course the fact that it is an explosion because two things can't match. It's going to actually have a disadvantage, and that disadvantage are the laws of thermodynamics. And I'm afraid this is where the big deal begins, because the second law of thermodynamics, the slot, as I call it, second law of thermodynamics, is the curse of our universe. As our universe has budded off in the center, I explained the paradigm I kind of envisioned it happened in. Well, I think the problem there is that this universe of ours is obviously going to end as a result of this incredible, insatiable power to break things up, which is what the second law is. It's that which is created in chaos and randomness and can never be stopped in its inertia to do this. So all cosmologists, I think 93% was the last figure I saw recently about the numbers of cosmologists that actually accept the cold death scenario now of the universe, where everything is supposed to end in one huge cold mass of nothingness, frozen at absolute zero, and of incredible, almost absolute force, that even the tiniest particles will be unraveled and the entire thing will be presented in this kind of fashion, that there is nothingness. And then you're left with the question, why bother in the first place for universes to happen, unless, of course, they are incidental creations, things that just happen because of the reasoning, the logical, meaningful reasoning behind things, rather than some old fellow there saying, now a universe is going to happen because I will it, and praise me for the rest of my whatever, natural, Sounds rather ludicrous when put in those terms. But, if I approached a child or children with a thing like that, I think they would laugh, and rightly so. Yet so many people believe this these days. And I really don't want to take away their comfort points or whatever, but really, come on, stop and think, because there's something behind each of us that is so magnificent and so wonderful and such a potential for an eternal, shall we say, an eternal existence, that all of this just kind of, pollutes the whole thing, and many people, I think, then go into all kinds of states of despair and whatever. Maybe there's something to be said on the right side of things, never mind about the greys and all this kind of chilling prospectus, but I believe in the power of thought, thinking, and that ability to think in ways of union, which then marries in with the God-verse, which then propels you into the God-verse, and of course, I happen to believe, actually, and I don't want to go into another subject immediately, but I will take this on later maybe, but I happen to believe in reincarnation as the only way that we can plausibly think in terms of a kind of eternity, and I will justify that with much evidence. There's no doubt in my mind that there is this principle, and it does prevail, and that if this is so, it gives us this tenure, this kind of, existence into the future that I believe that these greys are after, in fact. So they can see us being born. Maybe their technology can actually follow us into what might be the dominions of death, and then back again into life. I have a theory that death is within the space between atoms, and that the God-verse is that center point of no force that lies between all aggregations of atoms, right in the center, and that what the God-verse actually is the emanation of a force pulling us in. Gravity may well be the voice of the God-verse, pulling things together again, and that's why they can't find it as a force. All these scientists looking for gravity, it may be it's not a force. Maybe it is this tug of the God-verse within everything that's created in our universe. So you see, exciting ideas budding off, but I have to justify them. I have to be able to bring the scientific papers and all our science boys and all the discovering and say, hey, take a look. It ain't so far-fetched. These guys are looking at it, and look, it's implying this. Now, my books, if I say this myself, actually make an effort to include great scientific proof in it. Instead of just claim and theory, whatever, I try to back it up with things that actually will show people this might be plausibly true. Look, other people have seen this too, and so we kind of connect the whole thing up then,
So in one way, these artificial beings, this artificial created entities, in some way also end up outside of a certain parameters of rules that seems that the rest of the universe is restricted to, or we abide by these laws on a natural, consequential way almost, but these beings end up in between there. Maybe you can talk about that.
Well, that's right. I make this statement unreservedly in terms of what I've researched and looked at and written books about, and that is that natural life forms are the primary and the glorious and the ones that belong in terms, if you like, in terms of return, choice, knowing, understanding, self, motivation, control, option seeking, and so forth, of values that might go yin or yang. Artificial life forms have only one program where they go. They go according to the program. So you can't really fall down and worship the machine. Although, I've been accused of being a racist against the machine. The greys have to be machines. That would be probably one of the most bizarre accusations anyone had to face, really. And I find this really, really amazing that human beings can actually genuflect in front of something that might, end up as a nominal thing, probably less in value than an insect. It doesn't live. It doesn't live.
It's an interesting idea and concept, and if I put it this way, if we didn't go down the route of developing these machines and robots, just wait until they put a proper face on there, and the day they can replicate human emotion to a perfect 100% degree, then people would probably start treating them differently as well. You know, if they just can replicate all the attributes that we consider to be human on the surface, at least, then they would be...
That's right, on the surface. That's a crucial point, Henrik.
Yes.
If they may be able to do it on the surface, it would be obviously like a Hollywood actor playing a part. It would never be felt, it would never be known, it would never be connected up to a base, a base, as a living being can do it, because we came in with the universe, all of us. We have an ancestral line going back. Now, I hesitated to use the word soul. I was so kind of, non-religious. I didn't want to use the word soul, but it struck me that it's a wonderful way of describing just simply the track back to the beginning, to Godhead. That with what came before the Big Bang, in other words. So what we all have is that unmitigated, uninterrupted line. All living beings, even an insect. That's why I believe it's superior, to a machine produced out of parts from within now, here and now, or then, or whatever. But we, living being, always has this beautiful track all the way back in ancestry, all the way back to a beginning. And that is what I call a soul. That line, that track. No magic, if you see what I'm trying to say,
right.
Religious connotation, but simply that track of information, if you like, that goes all the way back for each and every one of us. And as you say, in the creation of machines with plastic faces and plastic emotions, they are always going to be plastic emotions, because you cannot program into a mechanism what it is to feel and know self. That is completely important. You have a pseudo-self or a pseudo-emotion, but never a real one that can track back and have a point from which you can take an original reference. And that original reference, if it then encapsulates an entirety of understanding in the whole, that's why I call the God verse that which is whole and absolute. And again, I don't want to seem religious when I do this. It's really a very secular point I'm making. I hope that you will understand that. Mm-hmm. That we can see these things outside the norms of things called religion or whatever. But I really don't like, I have to say I'm allergic to organized religion, but the problem is quite simply that you get all kinds of charlatans and nonsense written about these kinds of, religious people and so forth, that, it's very strange. It's very puzzling for people how the son of a god, shall we say, in the Christian ethic, the Christian teacher, Yeshua ben Yosef, comes and says, love thy neighbor as thyself, and the entire cascade comes about the opposite way, killing each other, if you see what I'm trying to say. So people get very kind of, worked up about this, and I don't like and to associate it with religion for that reason, basically.
Yes. Nigel, I think we should do like this. I have one more question I want to fire off to you here, and then maybe we can take a little break at that point and continue, because we have so much more to discuss. We've only reached halfway through here and some of the points that we want to bring up. But if we talk about this final little point or question here, and then we can take a little break, and you can mention your websites, of course, before we do that. But I wonder if these machines, again, then have so much intelligence in that sense that they have the possibility of developing at least a pseudo kind of ego, if you know what I mean by that word, that they have such a the intelligence is there to analyze things enough to realize that they lack things, and in this case we're talking about a soul.
I take your point, but you see, it's important when we think about intelligence and the intelligence that these things have to understand that they're really a compound interest addition process and subtraction process. They just add one fact to another. They don't have a sense of analysis of that fact only in a mathematical sense of yes or no, the binary system. It's just a simple choice point. So when we talk about intelligence, it's not this overwhelming kind of permutative combination of all things and arriving at a reference against which they can place that. See, that's what we have, I believe, that gives living intelligence always a much greater stance over anything that is created as an artificial intelligence. We can refer that back to a central thesis and then compare that. If we go back to a thing called a God-verse point, then all knowledge is there, and the reference with which we learn anything is placed against the whole compendium of knowledge, so to speak, you know? And that is an incredible advantage, and that gives you a sense of self-identity, a sense of reference. Now, when you make a machine, and the machine intelligence, what they call artificial intelligence, is really adding all these things and making larger numbers possible quicker, if you see what I mean. And in fact, you know, Henrik, people acknowledge now that the computers have gone as far as they can. In fact, all basic kind of procedures and so on can't progress any further than this. You can make quantize and think in huge multiples of the thing they're doing now, but multiplied many times over. But they themselves aren't anything but dumb. That's the point. A machine is always going to be dumb. But if something comes in from the beginning of the universe, it brings in, I believe, that whole amount of knowledge, the center of absolutes where all things are in perfect union and harmony. That then gives you the information to make, if you like, from that a incredible assessment of all things as a comparator, as a point against another point, and so forth. And that cannot be beaten. You have to be created, if you like, by the very existential design itself. And that's what even the humblest of us human beings is. It might teach us, perhaps, if we look at it that way, not to take each other for granted so much, you know. And that's what I'm hoping the books will finally show by looking at the alternative, like the Greys, if you like.
Very good. Well, why don't we do like this, and we'll take a short break here, Nigel, and then we'll carry on talking more here in our next segment for our members. But to round things up for us, why don't you mention the titles of your books again, of course, and also your website, so people know where to go to get a copy and read more about you and your work.
Yes, my first book was Song of the Greys. All copies have been sold. We are waiting for a publisher to republish that particular one. The second one is called Alien Greys and the Harvesting of Souls. Alien Greys and the Harvesting of Souls, published by I've forgotten the name of my publisher. Inner Traditions, and it's actually Bear & Company in America. Okay. I mean, I don't, please understand, and this is not any kind of false thing I'm saying here, I don't like advertising my books. I like people to find them in their own terms, and maybe that's a better discovery process. But yes, okay, they must know it's there, mustn't they?
Absolutely, and that's what we're doing here, trying to highlight some interest of abductions and things like that.
Indeed. It seems a bizarre thing, and it was indeed the same with the actual experience. I have no personal experience with the alien phenomenon as such. I can't say that I have any personal experience with the actual alien phenomenon, but I cannot say the same thing about paranormal activity. Now, I always had a kind of healthy disrespect for anything to do with what was loosely kind of referred to as New Age philosophies, you know, that were the craze in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if you go back that far, Henrik, but I certainly do. And my own family's kind of precision ground interest in science forbade this kind of thing, you know. And then something very interesting happened to kind of turn my whole world upside down and get me sort of thinking a little bit outside the box and a little bit, shall we say, in a more extended stance. And I don't know. I don't know if you don't want. I won't go into this anecdotal thing too much, but basically, I had a Swiss friend and I were quite interested in this kind of interface business between life and death, and as young people do, we were talking about this at quite I thought, rather a deep level. And this Swiss chap and I decided to kind of, come to the conclusion that we don't think there is anything past physical life and so forth. But just to explain how the whole thing kind of incidentally happens to you, these things never happen as an appointment sort of thing. They just kind of creep up on you,
Yeah.
And we're sitting there one day and discussing this, and he said, all right, the only way to prove this is that if one of us precedes the other in death, and we come back and we try and make a stir and convince. It's an absolute pleasure to join you in Europe from balmy breezes here in the Far East. And I hope we'll warm this thing up with a fairly good exchange of words, okay?
Absolutely. It sounds excellent, Nigel. We're very pleased to have you, and we really appreciate you coming on our program. There's obviously so much to talk about and so many things that we want to discuss here today during our time together. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how long you've been researching the abduction phenomena and this mystery, as it were, almost of the Greys, Nigel?
Yeah. Well, nothing really exciting. I'm kind of basically German British stock, essentially an expatriate background. We are kind of a science-based family. Came in long ago, various parts of the world, and settled in one particular place as European immigrants. My great-grandfather was a science teacher that was interested in science, and passed down this kind of predilection to my grandfather, who was a trained horologist. Now that sounds an excruciating word, but it simply means he dealt with science, instrumentation, and anything that kept time. Family business was in this, and it was at one time quite a thriving affair. My father was not a scientist. He was a British naval officer during the war, and he met my mother here in this island of Sri Lanka some years ago, quite a long time ago, and she was the daughter of a British planter here. And so I have a rather, shall we say, extended family set up, and a rather exciting one. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't really want to know all the boring details of my personal. Made me think quite a bit about what might be there, more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in our philosophy. But the thing that connected this to my friend, and this is where it becomes relevant to my Swiss friend, was that as soon as I saw this, I got the distinct smell, very strongly, of an aftershave only he used to wear. And in fact, I used to identify him coming into the house by this smell of his, and that was the thing that made me immediately associate this, perhaps, with what we discussed all those years previously. And I wondered, is this possible? Now, I'm a pretty hard-bitten guy when it comes to evidence of any sort. And, it stayed with me all my life, and I kind of, contemplated this. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe this was a genuine experience, and of course that then led me on to opening the doors, so to speak, a little bit more in my psychology to looking at things such as this. And then, if I may move over to my experience directly of UFOs such as I have it, my son, 12-year-old son, Darren, is a very smart little fellow, and he came to me one day and said, "Look, Dad, are these UFO things, are they real? Are they actual in our reality, or is it some kind of psycho-motivational mechanism or something that is, in the mind or whatever?" And I was immediately driven as an intuition or as a response to say, no, this is not real, this is nonsense, blah, blah. It's Mickey Mouse, Star Trekkers and all that kind of business and so forth. But I hesitated with Darren because he's a pretty clever fellow and he would have done the research, and if I was wrong, I would have been, embarrassed by him for sure. So I decided quietly, before I gave him the answer, finally, to have a look into these, see whether that it might exist or not. Just it's kind of jokey thing, And, of course, that was it. Many years later, very tragically, my friend died. And many years after that, I must say, something really incredible happened to me. I mean, it's rather comic when I recall it, but it was something that actually was very important in the kind of, if you like, etiology of my thinking about things that are a little bit different from the usual conventional stuff, the day's own troubles, shall we say. And it happened, strangely enough, in my bathroom. I was in the bathroom of my house, and something behind me told me to look behind the door of the bathroom, and I saw this brush lying on the ground. Now, I wasn't in a situation where I could pick the brush up at that moment, but I was watching this thing and thinking to myself, I'll put that back on the cupboard before I go out. And as I watched it, this thing moved about 6 feet up in the air, straight up and down, and there wasn't a living soul in the bathroom with me apart from myself, and I was 6 feet away from the brush. Now, this was the most startling thing that could have happened to me, because I thought at that time that all there was in physics, I thought I was the last word in physics. I was quite good at this kind of thing, and I had nothing to kind of explain this in any quantum terms either. And I wondered what on earth this thing was, what actually happened. And I actually saw this, and there's no one on this earth going to tell me it didn't happen, it was a dream, or I was on drugs or drunk, and I was perfectly normal at the time. And of course this life, but I'm married to an English girl living in England. I studied medicine, and in time, thing didn't work out. I did 4.5 years of medicine, and my wife's side of the family had social complications, which didn't allow me to finish my medical studies. However, I kind of drifted into writing, which I really love, and as we went along, of course, I started going to more and more extended associations with writing, and ended up as a freelance writer and journalist, writing films and articles for newspapers and so on. And during this time, I had no interest whatsoever, I might say, in this UFO phenomenon. I was, however, very interested in matters that bordered on the interface, as you said, between science and religion, and I'm rather allergic, I have to say, to all forms of organized anything, basically, but particularly religion. But at the same time, rather awed by the great wisdom that comes to us from all the major philosophical kinds of things, particularly the main religions and so forth. I have nothing against the old chaps who thought it all up, but as I say, I don't like the situation that has occurred since their demise and so forth. My graduate qualification is human behavioral psychology, but and that becomes quite irrelevant in terms of the subject we're going to talk about, I think, tonight.
Well, maybe not. We'll see, huh? We'll see in terms of psychology how this is impacting humanity on a psychological level. But maybe you can talk a little bit about just the aspect then of the grays and ufology. I mean, how do you go from a background like that you just described into this very kind of fringe area?